In 1831, a 26-year-old French aristocrat stepped off a boat in New York. His official job was strange and very specific. He had been sent by the French government to study American prisons. He spent the next 9 months traveling the country, and somewhere along the way he stopped looking at the prisons and started seeing the future. Because the book he wrote when he got home did not just describe America, it predicted it. Decades before they happened, he forecast the Civil War, the rise of mass conformity, and most stunning of all, a future world ruled by two giant powers, America and Russia, locked in a struggle for the destiny of the planet. He wrote that in 1835. The Cold War began more than 100 years later. His name was Alexis de Tocqueville, and this is the story of how one outsider in 9 months saw America's future more clearly than almost anyone who actually lived there. Stick around because his most unsettling prediction is about the country you're living in right now. Start with who he was. Tocqueville was born into the French nobility, a class that had just been nearly wiped out. Members of his own family had been sent to the guillotine during the French Revolution. He grew up in a world where the old order, kings, aristocrats, inherited privilege was visibly dying, and he became obsessed with a single question: what comes next? In 1831, he and his close friend Gustave de Beaumont got permission to sail to the United States, officially to write a report on its prison system. But that was partly a cover. What Tocqueville really wanted was to see democracy full-grown in the one place on Earth where it was already up and running. America was not really his subject. It was his crystal ball. He traveled almost everywhere, from Boston to the wild frontier, interviewing farmers, judges, former presidents, and backwoodsmen, and he was no cheerleader. As an aristocrat, part of him was disturbed by what he saw. But he came away convinced of one enormous idea, the idea that runs underneath his entire book. That idea was this: the march toward equality cannot be stopped. For 700 years, he argued, power had been slowly leaking away from kings and nobles and flowing toward ordinary people. Every invention, every war, every new law seemed to push in the very same direction: more equality. He called it a providential fact, something almost like a force of nature, and this was his warning to Europe. It is coming for you too, whether you like it or not. The only choice you have is whether to meet it wisely or to let it arrive in blood, the way it had in France. He did not cross the ocean because he loved America. He crossed it because America was the future, and he wanted to read that future before it arrived at his own front door. So what did the future actually look like? In some ways, it amazed him. What struck him first was that American democracy did not run from the top down. It ran from the bottom up. In the small New England townships, ordinary people governed themselves directly, voting on their roads, their schools, their taxes, their own affairs. They were not waiting for a king or even a president to tell them what to do. They simply did it themselves. He was fascinated by the jury, where everyday citizens learned to weigh evidence and to rule, and by the endless associations, the clubs and committees and societies that Americans formed for every purpose under the sun. Where a Frenchman would petition the government to act, he noticed, an American would simply gather his neighbors and get it done. He was struck too by religion. In France, liberty and faith were enemies. In America, they worked together, religion giving people the moral backbone that freedom quietly depends on. And he marveled at the newspapers, thousands of them, carrying ideas into every cabin on the frontier. Add it all up, and Tocqueville saw people astonishingly good at governing themselves without ever being told to. But the very thing that made their democracy so strong, he realized, also concealed its greatest danger, and almost no one living inside it could see what he saw. Here is where the book turns dark and where it becomes unsettlingly relevant. Tocqueville's deepest fear was not a dictator, it was the majority itself. In a democracy, he argued, the majority is not just a political force, it slowly becomes a kind of god. Its opinion is everywhere at once, and there is no higher court left to appeal to. Under a king, he said, power is merely physical. It can chain your body, but it cannot reach inside your mind. The tyranny of the majority is worse, precisely because it goes after the mind directly, and he wrote one sentence that should stop you cold. "I know of no country," he said, "in which there is so little independence of mind and real freedom of discussion as in America." Think about that. The freest country on earth, and he claimed, the least free to truly disagree. How? Not with prisons, with something much quieter. "Step outside what everyone around you believes," he wrote, "and you will not be thrown in jail. You will simply be frozen out, censured, abandoned, shunned. Your career quietly closed and your friends suddenly silent." He imagined the majority speaking to the person who dares to disagree. "You are free to think differently from me," it says, "and to keep your life and your property. But from this day on, you are a stranger among your own people. You may keep your rights, but they will be useless to you. Go in peace. I have left you your life, but it is a life worse than death." Tocqueville wrote that in 1835. He had just described almost perfectly the way a free society can pressure people into silence, not with force, with shame. If that sounds a little too familiar, that is exactly the point. He saw it coming nearly 200 years ago. Then came the predictions that would come true in blood. Tocqueville looked hard at slavery, and he did not look away. "The most formidable of all the evils that threaten the future of the Union," he wrote, "comes from the presence of slavery on its soil." He saw that the country was quietly splitting into two, a free North and an enslaved South, that increasingly did not even feel like the same nation, and he predicted that this could not hold forever, that it was pointing slowly but surely toward a violent reckoning. He wrote that a full generation before the Civil War tore the country in half, almost exactly as he had feared, and he looked at the native nations being pushed off their land, and he reached an even bleaker conclusion. They were being destroyed, he believed, not in one sudden massacre, but legally, quietly, treaty by treaty, mile by mile. He called it a kind of extinction carried out with all the forms and decencies of the law, and he doubted that anything now could stop it. This was the other face of his vision. The same democracy that governed itself so brilliantly was also capable of crushing the people it refused to count as equals. Tocqueville saw both things at once, the genius and the cruelty, and he refused to look away from either one. And then, at the very end of the book, he wrote the passage that still gives historians chills. He stepped back from America and looked at the entire world. And he saw in 1835 two nations that almost no one else was even watching. "There are two great peoples on the earth," he wrote, "who started from very different points, but who seem to be moving toward the same end, the Americans and the Russians. Both of them had grown up almost unnoticed, and while the rest of the world was looking elsewhere, both had suddenly risen to the front rank of nations. Every other great power," he said, "seemed to have already reached its natural limits. These two were still growing with no end in sight. One was conquering a wilderness with the plow, the other was conquering men with the sword. The main instrument of the American," he wrote, "is freedom. The main instrument of the Russian is servitude." And then the line that reads like pure prophecy. "Their starting points are different," he wrote, "and their paths are not the same. Yet each of them seems marked out by the secret will of heaven to one day hold in its hands the destinies of half the globe. Freedom against servitude, two giants, each holding half the world." He wrote that description of the Cold War in 1835, more than a century before it happened, back when Russia was a backward empire and America was a young, half-wild republic that had not even fought its civil war yet. He also predicted there would one day be 150 million Americans. Today there are more than twice that. So how did he do it? How did one young foreigner in just 9 months outpredict the very people who actually lived there? The answer is almost embarrassingly simple. He ignored the noise. He did not bet on this election or that famous politician. He looked underneath all of it at the deep, slow conditions, the rising tide of equality, and he asked one question: where does this have to lead? So strip it all away, and that is Tocqueville's real lesson. The future is not written by the loudest voices of the moment. It is written by the quiet forces underneath them, the ones that almost nobody is bothering to watch. Tocqueville watched, and nearly 2 centuries later we are still living inside his predictions. So here is my question for you. Of everything Tocqueville saw, the conformity, the tyranny of the majority, the two giants dividing the world, which one feels the most true about your life today? Tell me in the comments. And if you want more of the history they never quite teach you, subscribe. The next story might surprise you even more.